Hello, YouTube, and welcome to another edition of Moving Mud, the history of iron bombing. Once again, it has been a while since I produced an episode in our main narrative arc. The last one was episode 28, and we had a little historical digression with episode 29. But now we're back with episode 30, Iron Bombers, the Next Generation. Last time we talked about the shift in what precision meant. How, by the 1960s, the old idea that precision came from pilot skill, iron bombs, and courage under fire was no longer really enough. We saw how the rise of radar, SAMs, and integrated air defenses forced a rethink of bombing doctrine, and how the U.S. responded by leaning into its lead in solid-state electronics, building smarter avionics, terrain-following radar, and head-up displays. Precision was no longer just a matter of flying right, it was a matter of using and mastering the tools that the aircraft and eventually the weapons themselves provided to the pilot. What had once been, by and large, a battle of nerves between the pilot and the ground gunner was now becoming a battle of wits, not only between the frontline combatants, but also between the engineers and tacticians on both sides. In this episode, we're going to watch that shift start to play out, not in theory, but in metal. We're going to look at three aircraft that, each in their own way, embodied this new systems-first approach to strike warfare. First, we're going to talk about the A6 Intruder, the Navy's bold leap into the all-weather precision space with a cockpit that looked more like a submarine than a jet fighter. Then we're going to talk about the F111 Aardvark, a plane born of compromise and controversy that nonetheless became the poster child for low-level, high-speed, radar-guided strike. And then finally, we're going to talk about the F4 Phantom II, an aircraft that wasn't designed for precision strike at all, but was so adaptable that it became a key player in the smart weapons era to come, basically because it had to be. Now, because these aircraft are, on the outside, quite distinct from each other and not all that different from contemporary aircraft, they might not be recognized for what they were, which was a genuine turning of the page in the history of air-to-ground warfare. That history was on the verge of a period of some really, really rapid shifts in technology and doctrine for, almost 20 years. These three aircraft really started that shift, and by and large, they all stayed in service until a new equilibrium was kind of found in the early 1990s. So I think they're an important trio to take a look at if we're going to start looking at iron bombing the way it was practiced since 1970. So let's start with the A6. Since it was the first one off the drawing board, and because it really was a hybrid in some ways. The A6 Intruder began as a response to a 1957 Navy requirement for an all-weather, long-range, carrier-based strike aircraft. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation won the contract with a design that prioritized function over form. A squat, twin-engine, two-seat jet with no afterburners and no illusions about air combat. The A6 wasn't built to fight fighters. It was built to deliver bombs at night, in the rain, and in the worst conditions the Navy could imagine. Now, it was first flown in 1960, and it entered service in 1963. The A6A had a top speed of about 650 knots, but let's be fair, that was at altitudes it rarely visited. In its elements, it could probably do 500 knots if you pedaled really hard. It had a combat radius of about 800 miles and could carry up to 18,000 pounds of ordnance that distance. Its wide, stubby wings gave it excellent low-speed handling and short takeoff characteristics, which made it ideal for carrier operations. And the crew of two sat side by side in a cockpit stuffed with radar screens, navigation readouts, and attack computers, all cutting edge for their day. At a glance, it kind of looked a little unglamorous. But in reality, when it entered service, the A6 was the most advanced strike aircraft in the world. And by the end of the Vietnam War, it had proven that function, when paired with the right technology, could outperform flash every time. When the A6 Intruder entered the fleet, it represented more than just a new aircraft. It embodied a generational shift in how the U.S. Navy approached strike warfare. The idea of an all-weather bomber wasn't new. The Navy had long wanted a jet that could deliver ordnance at night or poor weather or through dense cloud cover, but the problem wasn't ambition, it was avionics. History of iron bombing listeners have heard this before, but it bears repeating. What held back the dream of an all-weather strike jet was not aerodynamics or engine technology, it was electronics. It wasn't until the early 1960s that the right combination of radar, computers, and cockpit displays came together to make the A6 possible. Even then, it wasn't easy. Contemporary sources and oral histories confirm that the A6's Diane system, a digital integrated attack and navigation equipment, was temperamental at best. Maintenance crews struggled with its complexity, and many intruder squadrons in Vietnam spent as much time troubleshooting their radar and computers as they did flying missions. But for all its quirks, the Diane system could do things and let the A6 do things that no other aircraft could. It let the A6 fly low, in the dark, through weather, and still find and hit its target. That made it revolutionary, and lethal when it worked. Even with these teething problems, though, when the A6 began combat operations over Vietnam in 1965, it quickly became the Navy's primary strike platform. The older A-1 Sky Raiders were relegated to search and rescue support, and the Intruder took over the heavy lifting, delivering high tonnage of bombs in all weather and at all hours across North Vietnam. Its low-level ingress profiles and radar-guided bombing runs made it uniquely suited for the escalating air campaign. Pilots initially kind of had mixed feelings. The A6 wasn't fast and it wasn't pretty, and it didn't have the raw power of the A1. Plus, its two-person cockpit placed the bombardier navigator beside the pilot, not behind, which was a setup that gave it kind of a submarine kind of feel. But in the words of one aviator, it went where others wouldn't, and it survived. The airframe was rugged and forgiving and could carry a prodigious bomb load. Now, Vietnam tested the A6's limits, but it also validated its core concept. After the war, the Intruder stayed in service for decades, not because of its speed or stealth, but because it was a platform that could evolve. New radar, new weapons, and even new missions were layered onto the basic airframe. It was a classic example of a systems platform, a relatively unglamorous jet that succeeded because it was designed to do one thing very well, and to do it in almost any conditions. But to really understand what made the A6 revolutionary, we have to kind of zoom in on its brain, which was the avionics. At the heart of the A6 was, as I said before, Diane, the digital integrated attack and navigation equipment system. Now, this wasn't just a radar upgrade or some kind of smart bomb sight. It was a leap, an attempt to fuse multiple complex systems, search radar, tracking radar, radar altimeter, and an inertial navigation platform, all into one integrated analog computing environment. The goal was clear: allow the Intruder to find its way to the target, avoid terrain, drop bombs with precision, all without needing visual reference, daylight, or decent weather. Now, that might sound kind of ordinary today, but in the 1960s, especially the early 60s, it was actually kind of audacious. Diane could only happen because of a breakthrough in miniaturized electronics and analog computing. Even then, it pushed the limits of reliability. Pilots and maintainers in Vietnam often joked that Diane needed as much attention as the engines. Failure rates were high, and maintenance crews routinely swapped out major black boxes between flights just to keep one jet airworthy. The reason for this was that at the heart of the Diane system was an analog computer system, an odd beast that was a hybrid that used a lot of solid-state electronics, but without the digital logic chips that were in their infancy at the time. See, an analog computer, what's meant by an analog computer is that it operated by manipulating continuously variable electrical voltages that represented different flight parameters, such as pitch, roll, heading, speed, altitude, distance to target. These voltages were fed into a series of amplifiers, integrators, differentiators, and servo-controlled devices that essentially solved the equations governing the aircraft's flight path, bomb trajectory, and its navigation course in real time. So here's how it contributed to the overall system. It provided real-time bombing solutions. The analog computer received inputs from the radar, both search and tracking, from the Doppler navigation system and the barometric altimeter. It integrated those with data on bomb ballistics to provide continuous update to the weapons officer, showing, for example, time to release and aim point, even while the aircraft flew through low-level turbulence or maneuvered aggressively. It did navigation integration. The computer worked with the Doppler radar data to perform dead reckoning navigation. This was critical for the all-weather capability, allowing the crew to locate targets without visual confirmation. It also stabilized the displays. The analog system fed outputs to cockpit instruments and the attack radar displays, helping the bombardier navigator keep track of the aircraft position relative to the terrain and the target. The challenge of an analog computer was, and is, that since it depends on continuously varying voltage signals, it was highly susceptible to electronic noise in a way that discrete voltage levels in a digital computer are not. This is what made the system temperamental. I can only guess just how much of an art form tuning and testing a Diane system would have been, and it would have been an art form. The techs that were good at it were probably worth their weight in gold. And I'm willing to bet, in fact, that the improvement in Diane had less to do with making it less cranky and more to do with training a generation of techs who understand how to predict its good moods. When it worked, it really worked, though. A6 crews flew at night through cloud, under radar, snaking through terrain with no visibility and still delivered bombs on targets. This was made possible by Diane's ability to guide the aircraft via radar fixes and inertial nav, with the radar bombardier calculating release points in real time. Unlike earlier jets, the A6 could fly and fight without the help from ground controllers or visual cues, and it also meant that it was effective. It deployed in small elements because it was not necessary to have one experienced navigator guiding the whole mission package, and that made it the first truly independent strike platform in the U.S. Navy. And tactics evolved accordingly. A6s began operating in small elements, executing radar-guided attacks on fixed sites in all conditions. Diane allowed pilots to pick their own ingress routes, hug terrain features to avoid detection, and hit targets without ever crossing into the kill zone of a radar-guided SAM. In some cases, A6 crews struck targets that had been untouched for months because other aircraft simply couldn't reach them safely. This capability changed the game for Navy strike doctrine. The A6 took over the heavy lifting from the A1 Skyraider, which had by 1965 been reassigned to ResCap and other support roles. For the next 2 decades, the Intruder would anchor carrier air wings, not because of its airframe, which was rugged but unremarkable, but because it could carry and operate a system that let it do something no one else could: strike with precision under any conditions from a platform that didn't need to see the enemy to kill them. Now, if the A6 was the Navy's answer to precision in all weather, the F111 Aardvark was the Air Force's attempt to build the ultimate deep strike platform, fast, low, and untraceable. It was a bold aircraft shaped by new doctrine, new technology, and a political vision, that didn't actually survive contact with reality. The F-111's roots stretch back also to the late 1950s, when the United States Air Force Tactical Air Command recognized a growing need for a supersonic, all-weather strike aircraft that could penetrate Soviet-style defenses. The idea was to combine high-speed ingress and very low-altitude flight, allowing the aircraft to avoid detection by radar and reach targets behind the front lines. The doctrine was clear: survive by staying low and fast, strike hard, and with precision. But this concept collided with another unstoppable force named Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who believed in reducing redundancy across the services. McNamara pushed for a joint service aircraft that would satisfy both the Air Force's need for deep strike and the Navy's desire for a long-range fleet interceptor. That aircraft became the TFX, or Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, which would eventually end up being the F-111. In theory, the F-111 would do everything. In practice, it did almost nothing right at first. The Navy wanted a 2-seat fleet interceptor that could handle carrier landings and radar missile engagements. The Air Force wanted a terrain-following bomber that could fly nap of the Earth at Mach 1.2. The result was a compromise airframe that was too heavy for carrier use and too complex for rapid development. Now, the Navy version, the F111B, was eventually canceled, and the F111 continued as the United States Air Force only project. But even that path was rocky. Early models of the F111A suffered structural failures, engine reliability problems, and some high-profile crashes during flight testing. Its revolutionary swing-wing design, which allowed for high-speed dash while retaining fairly benign low-speed takeoff and landing characteristics, worked, but it had a lot of complexity and a lot of weight. And the same went for its terrain-following radar and its inertial navigation system. These were cutting-edge features that required constant calibration and maintenance. But the F-111 wasn't just a delivery platform. It was also a technological pioneer. One of the most distinctive and influential features was its swing-wing design, also known as variable geometry wings. Until that point, aircraft designers really had struggled to reconcile high-speed performance with low-speed stability. Earlier jets were often optimized for one or the other, but rarely for both. The F-111 changed that. By sweeping its wings back in flight, it could cruise at Mach 2 speeds, and then by extending them, it could take off and land at manageably slow speeds and with manageable flight characteristics. It was one of the first high-performance jets to actually combine these two features. The swing-wing design would be extensively copied for another couple of decades, until it was replaced by even more sophisticated aerodynamic features like wing leading edge extensions and fly-by-wire technology. Despite the setbacks, the Air Force stuck with it. What saved the program was its underlying concept, an aircraft that could fly under the radar, literally, and strike with speed and surprise. The F-111A entered combat in 1967 and was sent almost immediately to Vietnam under the auspices of Combat Lancer, a limited combat evaluation deployment. That deployment ended badly. Within a few months, 3 of the 6 deployed aircraft had crashed due to structural failures in the wing carry-through box, which was, let's face it, a catastrophic weakness in the design. So the F-111 was grounded and nearly canceled, but further redesigns, including a strengthened wing box and upgraded avionics, eventually led to more stable performance, and by the early 1970s, the F-111 returned to Vietnam, in force now, and flying missions under Operation Linebacker and Linebacker 2. And this time, it delivered. The Aardvark's ability to fly at night, at low altitude, and bad weather made it ideal for precision interdiction. It could take off from Thailand, descend at 200 feet, fly under the enemy's radar net all the way to its target, whether that was a rail bridge in Haiphong or a power plant in Hanoi. Its terrain-following radar allowed for fully automatic low-level flight, adjusting the aircraft's altitude on the fly based on radar returns. Pilots described it as riding a roller coaster in the dark, terrifying at first, but eventually something they came to trust. Most importantly, the F-111 proved to be one of the most survivable strike platforms in theater. Where F-4s and A-7s needed suppression of enemy air defense support and tankers, the F-111 could go it alone. It carried a heavy bomb load, up to 24 Mark 82s internally, and could hit targets with remarkable precision using its internal navigation and radar systems. It wasn't just flying blind, it was flying smart. And in the final stages of the war, the F-111 took on a new role. Precision weapons delivery. It became one of the first tactical platforms to carry guided munitions, including laser-guided bombs designated by other aircraft. This marked the start of a transition which would define the next generation of air power. Precision not just in flight, but in the weapon itself. Now, if the A6 and F-111 were designed from the start to be systems-based strike platforms, the F-4 Phantom II took a completely different path. It wasn't built for precision, it certainly wasn't built for bombing. It was originally developed by McDonnell Aerospace for the U.S. Navy as a fleet defense interceptor. The F-4 was born to carry missiles, climb fast, and kill Soviet bombers at long range. It had no internal cannon, no fly-by-wire system, and no illusions of being a dogfighter. And yet, by the end of Vietnam, it was kinda all of those things. The F-4's origins go back to the late 1950s, when McDonnell Aircraft proposed a twin-engine, two-seat naval fighter capable of carrying long-range radar-guided missiles. The Navy accepted the proposal, and the aircraft entered service in 1960 as the F-4H-1, later redesignated F-4A. Its performance, honestly, at the time was phenomenal. Mach 2.2 at altitude, excellent climb rate, an unmatched payload for a fighter at the time. The Air Force, initially skeptical, was eventually convinced and adopted the aircraft as its new air supremacy platform. When the war in Vietnam escalated, the F-4 quickly found itself doing everything, though. It flew fighter sweep, close air support, bombing, reconnaissance, and wild weasel suppression of enemy air defense missions. It wasn't a natural bomber. It lacked an internal bomb sight, and it depended heavily on visual targeting. The F-4's early bombing missions were inaccurate at best, and while it could carry a wide array of ordnance, its avionics suite wasn't really optimized for ground attack. Now, that did begin to change mid-war. That's because if the F-4 was anything, it was versatile. It was large enough and powerful enough that it could handle extensive internal and external modifications. So it was a natural choice when the Air Force and Navy wanted to deploy new weapons, sensors, or computer systems without having to design a new airframe around them like they had for the A6 and the F111. They just chose the F-4. Throughout the Vietnam War, both the United States Navy and the United States Air Force adapted the F-4 extensively, adding external targeting pods, electro-optical sensors, and later laser designation capabilities. The aircraft was also modified to carry the first generation of precision-guided munitions, including the Paveway laser-guided bombs and the electro-optical GBU-8. In that sense, the F-4 became the first, truly multi-role platform of the modern era. And the point, I think, that is often missed is that the key to being a multi-role platform was that it could carry and integrate a lot of different avionics mission systems. It was not that the F-4 was the most sophisticated airframe. It flat out wasn't. I mean, the Rhino was always a victory of thrust over aerodynamics. But by 1970, it was no longer a case of how it performed on the outside. It was a case of what it could carry on the inside. And it was powerful enough, roomy enough, and had the crew capacity to continue to adapt as the mission kits kept coming. It was this adaptability that kept the F-4 relevant. Despite being a retrofit case, not a purpose-built aircraft, the Phantom kept pace with the revolution in weapons technology. During Linebacker 2, F-4s escorted B-52s, flew suppression of air defense missions, and even dropped precision-guided munitions on hardened targets. No other aircraft played as many roles in as many environments throughout the war. But the F-4 had limitations, and nowhere were they more evident than its handling characteristics. It was notoriously difficult to maneuver at low speeds, especially in close combat. The early models, A through D, were what the pilots called the hard-wing Phantoms, meaning they had no leading-edge slats, and this made them fast but extremely unforgiving at low speeds. The lack of lift-enhancing devices made slow-speed flight basically dangerous and degraded turn performance significantly in a fight. That changed with the F-4E, which entered service after Vietnam. This model included leading-edge slats, sometimes referred to as the soft-wing configuration. The slats improved low-speed handling, giving the F-4E better agility and more predictable stall characteristics. In essence, the soft-wing upgrade addressed some of those same maneuverability problems that the F111 swing-wing design had solved, but in a simpler way. It wasn't enough to make the F-4 a dogfighter, though, but it did close the performance gap. Looking back, the F-4's greatest contribution wasn't its raw performance or its original design intent. It was its versatility. It adapted to a rapidly changing battlefield and carried the United States through a difficult transitional period in air warfare. In doing so, it became the bridge between the second-generation fighters that relied on pilot intuition and future platforms that would rely on computers, sensors, and precision weapons. It did this because it could provide a platform that could host all of the early versions of those things effectively. If there's a single thread that ties the A6, the F111, and the F4 together, it's that all three marked a break from the past, not just in how they were flown, but in what they represented. These were not simple machines. They were large and heavy and complex, and they pushed the limits of avionics integration, airframe design, and mission versatility. And oh my, they were not cheap. Compared to their predecessors, the A4 Skyhawk, the F8 Crusader, maybe the F100 Super Sabre, these new platforms represented a clear shift in philosophy. By the early 1970s, the United States military had begun to commit fully to the idea of fewer but more capable aircraft. Precision no longer came from numbers, it came from systems, and from airframes that could carry those systems into battle and survive the fight. But as much as these aircraft evolved, they were still limited, at least initially, by the bombs they carried. The A6, the F111, the F4, all relied initially on iron bombs and visual cues. Precision was being pushed upward, but from the pilot to the platform, but the munitions themselves were still not particularly bright. But that's about to change, because while this episode focused on the platforms, the machines that made the precision possible, the next episode is going to be about the weapons. In the history of Iron Bombing 31, we'll dive into the history of precision-guided munitions, how they emerged, how they changed the math of bombing, and how they reshaped air power doctrine for decades to come. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.